4, 5, 6. Реально дорога смерті.
Some of the most chilling images to emerge from Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine came from Bucha, a town that his forces occupied for a month in March. These videos, being seen now for the first time, are among a trove of evidence the New York Times has obtained that reveals how one military unit committed potential war crimes on one street in Bucha, Yablonska Street. Residents like Victor Shatilo bore witness.
Мысли были от того, чтобы были какие-то хоть доказательства. Не со слов было, чтобы понятно, что происходит, а то, что было документально видно.
A few doors away, Irina Abramova was hiding with her husband and father when soldiers barged into their home.
За 3 минуты нас отсюда киш, все горит тут, Олег застреленный лежит.
They executed her husband.
Лежить ровненько, я бачу, що тут пусто.
"40-year-old Oleg is one of dozens of people the Times has identified who were killed along Yablonska Street. Death certificates show that most of them were shot dead. For families to see the perpetrators in court, it is not enough to simply say the Russians did this. Evidence must link a specific military unit and its commanders to these crimes. Over 8 months of reporting in Bucha and New York, our investigation set out to determine who was responsible. We analysed thousands of hours of video, from street cameras, residents' phones, and drones flown by the Ukrainian military, to retrace the Russians' movements hour by hour as one military unit took over Yablonska Street. Wherever they moved, we found conclusive evidence directly linking that unit and its commanders to the killings of civilians. At 4 locations, we caught soldiers in the act of killing. By identifying vehicle markings, the code names of commanders heard over the radio, and calls placed by Russian soldiers using the phones of victims, we identified the main unit responsible, the 234th Guards Air Assault Regiment, a paratrooper unit based in Pskov in western Russia. This investigation shows in damning detail that these killings were not random acts of violence, but part of a methodical, planned and lethal operation that may amount to crimes against humanity. 3 days into the invasion of Ukraine, on February 27th, a convoy of Russian soldiers advances towards Kyiv. By now, they're entering the nearby suburb of Bucha. Their route is a straight shot to the capital, through this intersection at Yablonska Street. But Ukrainian fighters ambush them, badly. They suffer heavy losses and retreat.
Слава Україні! Героям слава!
By March 3rd, just as a sense of normalcy returns to Bucha, so do the Russians. These are paratroopers, some of Russia's best trained and best equipped troops, and their job is to secure strategic areas. This time, they still intend to push for Kyiv, but they move more carefully along a different route and head to this industrial site at 144 Yablonska Street, where they'll set up a base. As the Russians enter, a Ukrainian checkpoint here is being manned by volunteer guards and fighters. Days earlier, some of them had enlisted with the territorial defense to protect Bucha. Now, as the Russians come, they hide inside this home, a decision that would cost them their lives. The Russians take no chances. As soon as they hit Yablonska Street, they fire at anything that moves, including civilians. This exact strike killed the local Bucha man, Volodymyr Ruchkovsky. His girlfriend, Olena, tried to pull him from the car. She had no choice but to escape. The Russians now sweep along the street. They cleared the entrance to the industrial building and take over the entire complex.
Моя группа лево принять. Не будешь стрелять, если ты шевелиться не будешь.
Directly across the road from the Russian base, 6 security cameras are simultaneously filming. The soldiers tried to break them, but some keep rolling. They record soldiers talking to each other and capture evidence that identifies high-ranking commanders. We repeatedly hear the codenames Flakon, Astra, and Uran. We obtained these military files the Russians left behind in Bucha when they were ambushed days earlier. They show that these names are the call signs for top commanders in the 234th Regiment. Astra and Flakon are commanders of battalion tactical groups, and Uran is the head of the 234th Regiment. Repeatedly, Astra reports up to Uran, and Uran issues orders back to him. This radio chatter is our first evidence linking the 234th Regiment and the highest leaders of that unit to the crimes on Yablonska Street. Another conversation between soldiers foreshadows what will happen in the days ahead. The next day, on March 4th, Russian reinforcements arrive at the base. Soldiers secure the area, searching houses and looking for men of fighting age who may pose a threat. When this group of residents is led away, the men are separated from the women. Residents are then taken to the Russian base, where some are held and questioned. Soldiers also find the checkpoint guards we saw earlier, who hid inside a house overnight. These guards are no longer active combatants, and to harm them would be a war crime. Seven of these 9 men are about to be executed at the Russian base. Tetiana and Sergei Shmut lived next door and saw what happened.
Руки тримали за голову, їх всіх у ряд поставили на колінах, лиця до землі, і російські військові всіх їх тримали на прицілі. Вони були.
Раз, два, три, точно. 4, 5, 6.
CCTV then shows paratroopers leading the captured men away. Another neighbour, Volodymyr, witnessed this.
Вони, хлопці оцих із самооборони, повели до себе десь у штаб. А через минут 5 ми почули постріли. Ось.
Tetiana later sees the aftermath from her backyard.
Я повертаю голову, і вони там всі, хлопці вже були мертві, вже застріляні.
Drone video filmed just hours later confirms the witness accounts and shows the executed men in a courtyard by the side of the Russian base. This picture of the scene is graphic. They would lie here for weeks until the Russians withdrew. On March 3rd, we heard commanders on the radio. Now on March 4th, we see one outside the base. There's some sort of a commotion, and then a soldier calls out, "Comrade Colonel." Seconds later, a figure emerges and appears to give orders. We spoke with military experts and a detained Russian paratrooper who served in Bucha. They told us that this title, Comrade Colonel, is used only to address high-level commanders, including a regiment commander. His presence is significant. It means that a high-ranking officer is at the base the same day troops were executing civilians and prisoners of war. Later on March 4th, as Russian forces spread out from the base and continue along Yablonska Street, we confirmed that at least 3 more people are killed. Alexander Kovalevsky was getting food for his wife and son when he was shot dead just a few yards from their home. Mikhailo Krabovliak was fleeing Bucha with his family when Russian soldiers fired on their car. He was killed, and his 9-year-old stepdaughter Sasha lost her arm in the attack. A third victim we have yet to identify is lying by the entrance to a grocery store, blood pooling around their head. Throughout Russia's occupation of Bucha in March, various Russian units were encamped around the town. But the evidence we found overwhelmingly links one unit, the 234th, to the killings on Yablonska Street. On top of the commander call signs we heard earlier, rank-and-file soldiers from the unit took cell phones from these 2 checkpoint guards and used them to call home. In the case of this victim, Vitaly Karpenko, call logs we obtained from the Ukrainian authorities show that his phone made 8 calls to Russia. The first was placed within 6 hours of his execution. To identify the Russian soldier who made this call, we took the number in Russia that he dialed and found a social media profile linked to it. We searched the profile for relatives who were men of military age and found the soldier. We also called the number that the soldier dialed and spoke to a relative who confirmed his name and unit. Vladimir Vasiliev, a member of the 234th. Vladimir also used the phone of another checkpoint guard, Ivan Skiba. Ivan's phone was passed around to at least 15 other soldiers, and one after the other, they made 38 calls to Russia. We have confirmed that most of these soldiers were in the same unit, the 234th. While we don't know that these soldiers pulled the trigger, their calls back home within hours of an execution implicate their unit in these killings. We also found Russian vehicles in the 234th on Yablonska Street when civilians were killed. This symbol, a 2 in an upside-down triangle, denotes the 234th. It's marked on these vehicles being delivered to the unit at their base in Russia. Although soldiers painted over these markings to hide their identity in Ukraine, some did a shoddy job. We spotted 4 vehicles with numbers, tactical symbols and models that allowed us to trace them. We found 2 of those vehicles in archival photos of a military exercise of the 234th in Belarus in 2020. And we found the 2 other vehicles just days before the invasion of Ukraine, as Russian forces amassed in Belarus. We also visited the base days after the Russians left.
Таке от відбувається всюди. Сліди просто незрозумілого знищення всього навкруги.
And among the detritus they left behind was further evidence. boxes of ammunition and packing slips listing the military unit of the 234th. Local residents also found a letter addressed to a soldier in the unit at a nearby house. On the morning of March 5th, some residents along Jablonska Street flee. Just before the Russians begin to move. A heavy deployment of forces sets off. They're heading toward the intersection that leads to Kyiv, where they were ambushed before. But this time they turn in a different direction to take up a second base. The footage here, which has not been made public until now, shows a very organised and tactical operation. Several vehicles and soldiers crash through fences and occupy people's homes. Soldiers loot a supermarket for supplies. One group searches an apartment building. Other soldiers with machine guns and tripods walk along the street and set up sniping positions at the front of the convoy. Amidst all of the action, a figure emerges. Military experts and the paratrooper we spoke to told us that this too is a commanding officer, because he walks the entire convoy with a guard and a radio operator by his side. We followed him along the street and saw other soldiers running to and from him. When they near the intersection, most of these troops break off to set up the other base. 2 armoured vehicles take up position here as protection, with the machine gunners right beside them. Even though there's no clear threat, they start firing down Jablonska, where more bodies begin to mount. By 11 a.m, they kill their next victim, visible beside a downed tree. The armoured vehicles open fire again, and this time hit a blue minivan, barely visible in the drone footage. We found a witness along this street, Victor Shatilo, who saw the Russians firing up close and documented what happened from his attic.
Отсюда я все снимал, кстати. Здесь было все прекрасно видно. Первая фотография с этого места сделана 5 числа в 12:04. Уже лежит один велосипедист убитый и стоит расстрелянный микроавтобус.
Victor's photos help us to confirm who the Russians killed: a 68-year-old cyclist, Volodymyr Brovchenko, and in the van, Zhana Kameneva, who was trying to escape Bucha with her neighbours, Maria, Tamila, and 14-year-old Anna. Within an hour, there would be another victim.
В 12:46, через 40 минут, уже на фотографии видно еще один человек убитый, и микроавтобус просто уже горит, пылает.
It was 61-year-old Mikhailo Kovalenko, who was trying to leave Bucha.
Мысли были от того, чтобы были какие-то хоть доказательства. Не со слов было, чтобы понятно, что происходит, а то, что было документально видно. Правильно я делаю, я считаю, что я правильно делаю это все. И теперь это есть научные доказательства действительно того, что это сделали кацапы.
Back at the intersection, the commanding officer has now made it to the front of the convoy. He has a clear view of these victims, but does nothing to stop the killing. Cycling in their direction now is local resident Irina Filkina. She spent the first days of the war at work cooking for her colleagues. On March 5th, she borrowed a bicycle to return home to see her husband. When she rounds the corner, the gunner in this armoured vehicle aims its cannon at her and fires. Smoke and dust rise from where Miss Filkina stood. She's killed on the spot, while the commander is just 75 yards away. Sheltering inside this house at the time were Irina Abramova, her father Volodymyr, and her husband Oleg.
Почули стрілянину, Чоловік кричить, тут мирні, не стріляйте. Виходіть, руки в карманах что.
Іру там допрашують, Олега сюди потащили. Він говорить, хлопці, що ви робите? Що ви, хлопці? Це отакі о.
When Irina walks out onto Jablonska Street, she finds the cyclist who was killed outside her home.
Під стовбом лежала людина. Нога навпіл перебита була.
And then her husband Oleg.
На вулицю вийшла, а він лежить ниць. Пів голови немає, така калюжа, здорова крові, з уха ще так толчками виходить. Мозги. Біля нього кричать стало. Олег, Олег. А вони напротив сидять, воду п'ють. Спокійно так.
Videos filmed a month later when the Russians withdrew showed Irina Filkina lying beside her bicycle and Oleg's body on the ground outside their home. A member of the same unit we identified, the 234th, would later use Oleg's phone to call Russia. The soldiers left Volodymyr that day with a warning.
Дід, твоя дочка, моя. Забирай її, давай, уходи отсюда. Ми тут зачистку делаем.
They killed at least 8 people in around 3 hours on March 5th, and the clearing the soldiers warned of did continue, for weeks. But not just on Jablonska Street. Across Bucha, residents were gruesomely murdered in their homes. Their bodies left in wells, basements and garages. On Jablonska, the Russians moved in and lived alongside their victims. Residents on the street hid in basements. They shared with us the few videos they recorded. Some eventually ventured out to find food or check on family members, but ran into the Russians. On Jablonska Street, 5 more people are killed in days.
Каждый день добавлялось. Вот паренек был убит.
This is Oleg Verba, shot dead while he was carrying potatoes.
Это следующий угол, тоже убит велосипедист.
And Mihailo Romaniuk, who was also shot while he was cycling with a friend. When they're given the chance, some residents evacuate, but they have to pass the bodies of their dead neighbours. We know the 234th continued its killing spree after March 5th. Soldiers moved even further along Jablonska Street to this roundabout. They occupy houses here and set up a checkpoint. And on March 18th, we catch the unit killing civilians again. Volodymyr Lizovsky lived by this corner and sometimes filmed the Russians from his attic window.
Ми чітко бачили з вікон нашого будинку, вони облаштували собі тут КПП. І ми чітко бачили, що вони роздягають людей на вулицях.
He was a civilian during the occupation of Bucha and has now enlisted in Ukraine's military. On the morning of March 18th, he filmed Russian soldiers detaining a group of men and then executing them. One is already dead on the ground. 2 more appear to be on their knees.
Вони вбили спочатку одного, потім ще 2, а потім 4-ту людину, яка просто йшла і була свідком попередніх вбивств.
3 hours after Volodymyr films the scene, a drone captures the men's bodies, lying motionless in the same location, invisible to the world until the Russians withdraw at the end of March. The 3 men were Dmytro Shkirinkov, Maxim Kiryev, and, with his hands tied behind his back, Alexander Chumak. We have reporting that the 4th victim, the passerby, is this man found further along the street. Again, evidence we collected links the 234th to these executions. Soldiers took Maxim's phone, and at least 12 of them used it to call Russia just hours after he was killed. A note the Russians left behind at this house they lived in named several of the same soldiers, we confirmed that at least 8 of the soldiers who used Maxim's phone are in the 234th. 3 of them used the phone of another victim, Pavlo Valko, who was killed very nearby a week earlier. At the roundabout, at the intersection, and at the Russian base, our analysis of calls made to Russia shows that at least 22 soldiers in the 234th used the phones of Ukrainians killed along Yablonska Street. Again, we don't know that these specific soldiers were the executioners, but the evidence repeatedly places their unit where people were killed, when they were killed. And as this investigation has shown, there's a trove of other evidence. Vehicle numbers and insignia, documents the Russians left behind, and military badges, all showing that the 234th and its leaders were present as dozens of civilians were killed. Linking a unit and its commanders to the exact place and time of these killings is important. Military commanders, even if they did not pull the trigger, can be held accountable if they knew or should have known about the crimes their troops committed. And in Bucha, we know that commanding officers were walking among the dead. The call sign Uran, the person in charge of the 234th Regiment, is Artyom Gorodilov. Seen here in Belarus in February, getting ready for Russia's attack on Ukraine. 2 paratroopers with the 234th who served in Bucha told us that Gorodilov was there with them. He was barely out of Bucha when he was promoted at this public ceremony with the head of the airborne forces, Andrei Serdyukov. This happened the same week the world saw the horrific images out of Bucha. High-level commanders like Serdyukov and Gorodilov's immediate superior, Sergei Chubarkin, also bear responsibility for these atrocities. Whether they were on the ground or not, the killings continued for weeks on their watch and have never been investigated. Bucha is a community traumatized by Russian violence. The dozens of victims we documented on Yablonska Street are among over 400 people killed in the town in March. Kremlin officials have continued to deny what happened.
Мы столкнулись с провокацией в населенном пункте Буча, к которому российская армия не имеет никакого отношения.
The International Criminal Court is investigating crimes committed in Ukraine and may ultimately decide who to charge. But the evidence in Bucha is clear. Russian commanders and soldiers from at least one military unit killed civilians for weeks, assuming, or perhaps hoping, that no one was watching.